Welcome to the USC Center for Inclusive Democracy's webinar entitled California's 2024 General Election, Voting Methods and Early Voting. So I thank all of you that may have already been participants or viewers of our previous webinars this last month or so. I want to remind everybody that all of our webinars are recorded. The one we had about a week and a half ago on our new voter turnout report will be released soon. And this webinar that you're attending today is also, of course, being recorded. You got the notification, and the recording will be available probably in about 2 weeks. Give Price some USC Price some time to format it and get it out. So again, thanks for joining us. I'm going to jump in here in a moment, but I want to make sure you all know that there's the Q&A feature, of course. So as I present highlights from the new report that we're releasing today on voting methods and early voting, please feel free as we go along to put questions into the Q&A. I'll address those questions at the end of my presentation. And then, of course, at the end, feel free to jump in with any additional questions that you might have. So there will be a Q&A section after my presentation. And then the brand new report, in just a moment, when I start my slides, you'll get a QR code that'll take you to that report. You'll be the first in California to actually receive or access that report. It's just posted on our website. And then later this afternoon, we'll be sending it out to our networks. All right, so welcome again. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. So that research report that I just mentioned to you all, again, just posted on our website. You can get it here by just snapping this QR code, and you will be able to not only access the report, but there's also a 4-page highlights brief that's available there that gives just a set of highlights, a rough summary of the report. There's so much more in the report. It's quite a lengthy report and has a lengthy appendices as well. But you do have that 4-page highlight brief that's available to you as well on the website. It's a companion brief. Okay. And I want to thank, of course, the Haas Junior Fund for their generous support of this research. They have been a longstanding colleague, a partner of the Center for Inclusive Democracy on our research. They were partners on this research as well as this webinar. So I want to thank them. And as I already mentioned, a recording will be made available. So that recent research report that I referenced at the outset of the webinar today, again, it was titled California's 2024 General Election. For those of you that don't know, who voted and which voters stayed home. That is on our website. On the same page, you'll see this new report that you just snapped the QR code for. It was released last week, and it also has a companion brief, so you can get to the highlights as well if you want to see that. But no, if you're interested in turnout in California, that report is available and released if you haven't received it already. So today, I'm going to be talking about 4 main areas from our new research report being released today. So voting methods in the 2024 general election, vote by mail rejection rates in that election, and the question of when Californians cast their ballots, because of course, as I'll talk about in a moment, there are many different ways, right, that Californians can get their ballots back, and they have a period of time to be able to do that. And then who voted early in the 2024 general election? And this is a breakout of that population of voters who are the early voters in California. And all 4 of these areas, really throughout the report, all of our analysis is broken out wherever possible, which is the overwhelming majority of the report, broken out by race, ethnicity, age, party affiliation, gender, and also in this report by language preference. So in California, when you register to vote or at any point in time, voters can designate a preferred language that they would like to receive their voting materials in. I'll talk about that when we get to a little bit further along. I'm not presenting those data today, but that those data are available in our report. That's quite substantial, and I want to make sure people know that that is there. It does not reflect everybody in California. The short of it is, it does not reflect everybody in California that presumably needs language assistance, because it's just those that know about the option to request their ballots in a language other than English. But it does, if you understand that as that, the data as that population, which is limited in understanding, it still does give a lot of insight into the disparities in participation and the different voter experiences of that population. Okay, so I mentioned that all of the data today we're breaking out by race ethnicity. So in every webinar and in all of our reports, we want to talk about and acknowledge the limitations in identifying race and ethnicity in California. So for this research, we are using actual voter records, the 22 million registered voters in California, official voter records. And that means, though, that we do not have detailed data on race ethnicity. California is a volunteer state for that data. So when you register to vote or a different point in time, you can volunteer your race or ethnicity, but only a small proportion of California registered voters actually have given that information. And it's not representative of the full state. And so as researchers, not us and others in California, we have to utilize other methods to be able to try to identify the race ethnicity of a voter, of a given voter, or at least the probability, I should say, of the race or ethnicity of a California voter. It's challenging. It has limitations, particularly for a smaller population. In our big state, we have large numbers of many different racial and ethnic groups, but proportionally smaller populations. And in our report, we have a methodology section. We acknowledge the limitations, and we want people to understand that a little bit more. For today's purposes, we're presenting data, and also in our report, data for Latinos, Asian Americans, Black voters, and white voters. Black voters, we still caution that that there are limitations, particularly for Black voters, because of their smaller proportionally numbers in California. But for the type of analysis that we're doing in this report, the challenges are less, and we feel more confident in the data. So we present them here. I'm going to leave that there, but happy to answer questions as always in the Q&A on this topic, and again refer you to the report in the methodology section. So the first topic at hand today for our presentation, voting methods in the 2024 general election. So first, I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page here in terms of definitions. We have four main ways that you can vote in California, right? Well, two main ways that we often think about, which is voting in person and voting using a vote-by-mail ballot. But you can return that vote-by-mail ballot through the mail, through USPS, but you also can drop it off at an official drop box location, either internally or externally placed inside a building or on a street corner. Or you can drop it off at a staffed voting location, a polling place or vote center, depending on the system that you have in your county. There is, I just want to acknowledge, a new law on the books in California, AB 626. The 2024 general election was the first election after the passage of AB 626, which simply allowed vote-by-mail ballots, or the users of vote-by-mail ballots, to return their ballot to an in-person voting center or polling place without the signed envelope, to essentially, once it's verified that you haven't voted, right, to be able to have that ballot treated like an in-person ballot in terms of the voting experience. But in California, those ballots are supposed to be formally from the registrar's office of each county, recorded still as vote-by-mail ballots. I'll stop there because those are just a small number of voters in California that are taking advantage of the AB 626 in counties that are actually providing that as an option. We still have these four main ways, as you see here in California. All right. Now let's just back up a bit here and look at history. We have seen a steady increase over the last decade and a half in California of the use of vote by mail. And these are just general election numbers. If I was showing you primary election numbers, you would see actually the vote by mail, the proportion of all ballots cast that are vote by mail ballots is actually higher, typically historically in primary elections, but today we're focused on the general elections. So here in each column, you have the entire pie of actual voters cast in that election and what proportion was vote by mail ballots. So in 2012, we saw kind of a flip where we've passed the point where a majority of ballots cast in California were vote by mail ballots that generated a lot of policy conversations around what we should do, whether we should create policy that makes vote by mail more accessible, should we limit in our state in-person voting options, a variety of topics and reforms that kind of generated out of a real jump in the conversation around vote by mail once we reached that milestone of a majority of all ballots cast being vote by mail ballots. And you'll see in 2020, we already were a high proportions vote by mail, but we had a big jump, over 20 percentage points jump in 2020. 87% of all ballots cast in the state were vote by mail ballots. And we think in large part that was because of the policy change in the general election. The state decided for the first time to mail all registered voters in California a vote by mail ballot that they could choose to return in any way they wanted to. They could still vote in person, which some did. But it really jumped up, right, to 87%, really boosted those numbers. And we still saw just shy of 13% of all ballots cast being in person, traditional in person. Proportion stayed pretty high in 2022, actually increasing by 1%. And the question was, well, coming out of 2022, out of the COVID era, at least the primary COVID era, where there were greater concerns around going anywhere in person, but also voting in person. As that environment started to change, would we see these incredibly high vote by mail use numbers continue, especially considering that the mailing of everybody, the policy of mailing everybody who's registered a vote by mail ballot became permanent. It was not just, did not remain just in 2020 as the 2020 COVID policy. So what happened in 2024? Well, we still saw a very high percentage of all ballots cast being vote by mail ballots, but we did see a decline in the proportion. So down to 82% of votes cast were vote by mail ballots. That was just shy about 13 million of all ballots cast out of the about 13 million were vote by mail ballots out of the 16 million total ballots roughly that were cast in California, about 82%. So now we're going to break this out by voting method and then by all the different subgroups that I just mentioned earlier. So, and we're going to go pretty fast now. We're going to start going pretty fast through these slides. Know that, as I always say, that you could spend a lot of time on many of these slides and really highlight different things, right, depending on your perspective. I'm going to highlight some of the main points that we made in the report, but I, again, direct you to the report to really sit with these slides and these charts and these data to get more out of it and determine what is of most use and most interest to you in your work. So here, this is the pie of all voters in California in 2024. I already said that all ballots cast, 82% roughly were vote by mail ballots. But here we're looking at all votes cast in 2024. What's the breakout? So about 18% were in-person ballots, right? People casting their ballot traditionally at a voting place or a vote center. And then the most dominant way of returning their vote by mail ballot actually was drop box, 33%, followed closely by USPS mail. And then you see another 16% dropping of voters that cast ballots in 2024, dropping off their vote by mail ballot at a drop-off location. That's a staffed polling place or vote center drop-off location. So one of the noteworthy things here is that, of course, the most dominant method of voting, returning your ballot, right, is the drop box. But also that we see 18% of all ballots still cast being in person. And again, this is an increase over 2022 and 2020. I have a slight, caveat here. Just want to return to the conversation around AB 626. That we understand that people that are returning their vote by mail ballots to an in-person location, right? The county does have the option, once verified, to treat those voters as in-person voters in their voting experience. But again, all of those ballots are still supposed to be actually recorded as vote by mail ballots. There could be some misrecordings. We don't know if that is the case, and with all due respect to our counties, of course. But we still think that if that's the case, it's going to be very, very small. Not all counties even were functioning to support AB 626. So the 18% should be pretty still very close, even if there were some mistakes at the county level, which means, again, we had an increase in in-person voting in California in 2024, as we understand it now, at least. Now we're going to break out each of the pie of voters by race or ethnicity. groups, racial and ethnic groups. So on the far right is all voters in California. That same pie I just showed you, right? There's in green that 18% of all ballots cast being in person. There's the 32% by mail, 16% drop-off location, and 33% all voter. And by the way, I do want to return back to this. I want to make a point. I said how 18% were in-person voters. We really, though, always emphasize the importance of thinking about just voters, period, that are going through the in-person voting locations, that are being processed through those and utilizing them. And of course, there's 16% of California voters in 2024 that dropped off at an in-person voting location. When you combine 18% and 16%, right, you've got well over, you've got about a third of California voters that went to an in-person location. And we know from previous research at CID that there are real reasons why people choose often to or need to drop off at an in-person location, either to ask questions, to feel more comfortable, to be, if they're concerned about fraud, a variety of reasons. They want language assistance, whatever it might be. And so still those vote centers are being used more than just 18%. They're being used 18% and 16% combined in voting locations. So just an important point. So back here on the far right, these are the numbers I just gave you. And now we're going to look at it by racial and ethnic group. So on the far left, we see the pie of all Asian American voters in California. Again, I'm just going to highlight a few things here. But you see a smaller percent that are in person, that's the green, a larger percent by mail. And then if we turn to the Latino numbers, which also really stand out, the Latino population, you see Latino voters cast ballots in person at notably higher rates than other racial or ethnic groups. So here, almost 25%, a quarter of ballots cast by Latinos in the 2024 general election were in person, right? And then on top of that, you see higher drop-off location proportions, right? 18% versus 16% for the state. And you have a very large proportion of Latinos that are utilizing those in-person locations, right, for a variety of reasons. Here's in-person at a voting location or a vote center was more common among young voters. So here, breaking out again the pie of voters that cast their ballots for each age group, and you can see that green, over a quarter, 27, almost 28% of all in-person ballots were by young people, were in person. And you can see if you go up by age group, much smaller for older voters. Now I'm going to really just start highlighting a few things in each slide. So forgive me if I don't talk about something that you're interested in when you see a slide. Now by party affiliation. So registered Republicans, again, we don't know how people actually voted. They have a private vote in our state and country. But registered Republicans voted in person at higher rates than registered Democrats. So again, if you just follow the green line, Democrats 14%, Republicans 21, 22%, no party preference, a little bit lower than that, and then other party, that's all other parties as a registered right combined. Again, we also look at gender and also language preference in the report. Going on to the next section, vote by mail rejection rates in the 2024 general election. So in any given election in California, there's always a certain very small proportion and number of voters, well, a small proportion of voters whose vote by mail ballots get rejected. And we'll talk about the reasons in a moment. But in our very large state with so many voters voting, that still ends up being a large number. So in 2024 general, it was 0.9, just shy of 1% of all vote by mail ballots cast that were rejected. But that equaled, as you see in the second column here, 117 plus thousand voters that had their ballot rejected. The vast majority of rejected ballots were rejected for having signature issues. In the past, up until about 2020, we used to always see that the number one reason for ballot rejection of the population of rejected ballots was because it was late. But we've changed our policy in California, and as long as you get your vote by mail ballot postmarked on election day and it's received within, well, you have up to 7 days. It's received within 7 days, it'll get counted, assuming there's no other issues with it. So 59% of all ballots rejected, this is the pie of all rejected ballots, right, were rejected because of a non-matching signature, then another 11% for no signature at all, and then as you see, 27% for being late. Now we're going to break it out by population. Again, we're going to go fast here. The Latino vote by mail rejection rate was about a third higher than the general population rate. This is the case across elections. The numbers will change, but Latinos always have a higher rejection rate, slightly higher for Asian American. Black voters about on par with all voters. And you will see, as always is the case in California, 0.7%, a lower rejection rate for white, non-Latino, or non-Hispanic. Black and white, we're going to break this out a little bit more now here by looking at rejection reasons. So in each of these sections, we're going to show you rates by group, and then the reasons, then rates by group, then the reasons. So Black and white non-Latino voters had higher rejection rates for late ballots than the general population. So you can see that there if you look at the column for Black voters, and then you look at the column for whites, 31% and 31%, right, of their ballots rejected were rejected for being late. The other really noteworthy thing right here in the middle of the column for Latino voters, you'll see that almost 66% of all the ballots that were rejected for Latinos were rejected because of non-matching signature. Another 10% for no signature. So one of the things here to really point out is why are we breaking this out? For lots of reasons, but also for outreach and voter education, understanding why people are getting their ballots rejected can help better inform public education and outreach campaigns around trying to prevent people in the first place, right, having an issue with their ballot. Vote by mail rejection rates decreased as age increased. And this is a big one. And again, every election we see this, just the numbers will change a little bit. So for 18 to 24-year-olds, 3.3% of all of their vote by mail ballots were rejected, right? Much lower than the 0.9% for everybody. And you can see here much lower as you go down by age group, very low, 0.3 for 65 plus. Non-matching signature issues were more common among young voters than their older counterparts. So again, on the far left, you look at 18 to 24-year-olds, what dominates there, you see all that gold. So out of all of their vote by mail ballots that were rejected, these are reasons now, rejected, 72, almost 73% were rejected because of non-matching signature, right? Much lower as you go up in age. So again, if you're outreaching based on age, right, to young people or to senior citizens or folks in between, however they want to call themselves, older or not, these data we hope were helpful. Vote by mail rejection rates were highest among voters with no party preference. So again, by party affiliation, the pie of vote by mail ballots or rejection rates, you can see actually no party preference rate, 1.3%. And then I'll move on. Now looking at the reasons for rejection. So of the pie of actual rejected ballots, this is the breakout by reason for each affiliation. And you can see some small differences, but registered voters, registered Republican had notably higher rates of non-matching signatures than Democratic voters. Oh, now we're going to move on to when did Californians cast their ballots? Okay, warning. I'm going to show you some charts that have a lot of visual things going on. I'm not going to stop and walk you through all of it. It'll take just too long. But I really recommend you taking a look at the report and just sitting with some of these charts if they're of interest to you. I'm only going to pull out, again, just a few highlights. So to start, this is going to be no surprise to anybody, but in the 2024 general election, as we've seen in previous elections, early voting was dominated by mail voting, although small numbers of voters did return their vote by mail ballots to drop boxes in the weeks leading up to the November election day. On election day itself, drop box voting was the most common method, followed closely by in-person voting. And we are defining early voting pretty simply here. It's just those who return their vote by mail ballot or voted in person at a vote center or polling place anytime before election day. Okay. The majority of early voters returned their vote by mail ballot through the mail, while drop-off voting was the most common method on and around election day. So what you see here is the period of time, right, post when ballots or vote by mail ballots are mailed out. The blue line is drop box received. Red line is drop off location received. Gold is mail received, and green is in-person entered. And we do notice in the in the report that these are the dates when the ballots are actually processed and entered, not necessarily when a county has received the ballot, or certainly when somebody mailed off their ballot from their home. And there can be a lag. We explain it again in the report. But for the data that we have, this is when it's processed and received and recorded by counties. All right, again, a lot going on here. I'm just going to highlight the main title here in each of the slides. So in-person voting was used much less among Asian American voters on election day than the general population. And again, this slide is the pie of Asian American votes over this period. Black voters utilize vote centers and polling places on or around election day at higher rates than the general population. Again, this is the pie of all Black voters, all Black votes, right? Votes from Black voters during the October 7th to November 12th period. Again, because ballots can be, as you know, received as long as they're postmarked on election day, be received post-election, 7 days. All right, and then Latino voters utilize vote centers and polling places on or around election day at higher rates than the general population. There are small differences here, but there are differences, right? This is, we hope, again, helpful for outreach, voter mobilization efforts, both nonpartisan, but also by county elections offices as well. Private, nonpartisan, community work. Voting methods among white voters, these are white, non-Latino, non-Hispanic, mimicked general population trends, with drop box voting being the most common method on election day for white voters. Again, the pie of all white voters here during this period. Very few young voters aged 18 to 24 cast their ballot early, right? We noted that previously. And again, the last two segments, I just want to emphasize that we have in the report data by gender as well as language preference. And a lot more data for each of these groups as well, a lot more conversation. Okay, so who voted early in the 2024 general election? Lastly, here we're going to be showing you the pie of, it's a different perspective. Now it's the pie of early voters. And what does that look like? What's the composition, the demographic makeup, subgroup makeup? So first, if you didn't know, right, we were about 16 million actual votes in 2024. I think the official number is slightly over 16 million. Our number for our data is slightly under 16 million. But we've identified just shy of 9 million, 8,991,994 as early voters, as we defined it before Election Day. And that means 56% of all ballots cast and counted in California were early voters, right? That's quite large. White non-Latinos were overrepresented amongst early voters. So now we're going to be looking at the makeup of each pie of votes. So the early voters, and then compared to all voters. And this first slide, we're looking at the racial and ethnic makeup. So white non-Latinos were overrepresented amongst early voters in the 2024 general election. That first bar, green is white non-Latino, gold is Latino, red is Black, Asian American is blue, and again, purple here is other, and we apologize for using the other categorization, but we cannot break out other groups here accurately or reliably. So you see that, again, 54%, right, of early voters were white compared to 48, almost 49% of all voters. Young voters were underrepresented amongst early voters, as we already noted, right? This is a different way to look at it. While those aged 65 and older represented larger shares. So again, early voters here, here 18 to 24 is blue. 6% of early voters, again, that pie of early voters was 18 to 24. Overall voters, 9.1. And yes, overall young people are underrepresented in the voter roll, on the voter rolls, actual voter rolls, compared to their percentage of the adult citizen population. And then you can see older voters on the far end, 65 plus, that's that dark navy, I guess, 38 versus 27. No party preference voters were slightly underrepresented amongst early voters. So the no party preference here is that gold, blue for Democratic, red for Republican, registration again, right, party affiliation. Moving on. Now, early voters in the 2020, this is our last section, early voters in the 2024 general election by voter type. What do we mean by voter type? Here, we're talking about a propensity of voters. So many of you, I'm sure, have heard, maybe some haven't, that key designations, particularly amongst campaigns, is the propensity, the likelihood somebody's going to be voting. We use likelihood differently in the research world. But for our purposes here and for this report, these are our definitions. So what is a low propensity voter? Registered voters who have voted in 1 or 0 of the previous 5 major elections. Medium is who voted in 2 or 3 of the previous 5 major elections, and high propensity voters is voted in at least 4 or 5 of the previous 5 major elections. And we define it to include presidential and midterm general and primaries, but of course does not include special or local elections. Okay, so these are our definitions. People and campaigns will use, and pundits will use maybe potentially slightly different, but for the analysis, just keep this in mind. These are our definitions. Nearly 55% of early voters were high propensity voters, right? Much higher than the general population. So what are we looking here? This is the pie of early voters in California. I already told you there were about 56% of, almost 9 million of all votes cast in 2024. But here we're just now looking at the early voter pie, and we want to look at it by vote propensity. So 54% by high propensity voters, excuse me, that's the gold or yellow. Almost 20% were low propensity voters as we define it. And then 25% medium propensity. Might not be a surprise to you that such a high proportion high propensity, but yes, low propensity voters did vote early, right? Almost 20% of all early voters were low propensity voters. Now we're going to break this out by race or ethnicity. So the pie of early voters for each of these groups, and we see Asian American and Black early voters were less likely to be high propensity. So within Asian American, what's the breakout? Asian American early voters, what's the breakout by low, high, and medium propensity? So Asian American and Black early voters were less likely to be high propensity voters than their Latino and white non-Latino counterparts. And I know we're going to go through all of this fast, the last few slides. Again, just highlighting a few things is why I've put these points on top of the slides to pull out what we're going to be focusing on. But again, you could focus on many different things here. The majority of early voters age 65 and older were high propensity voters, while the majority of young early voters were low propensity voters, right? You see this very clean a step down or step up, depending how you're looking at it, right, by age. And then summary, 2 slides here. The overwhelming, just to remind us, pull us back to some of the key points here. The overwhelming majority of votes in our most recent general election were cast via vote by mail ballots. We know about 83%. Historically underrepresented groups voted in person at higher rates than the general population, so lower vote by mail use rates, although it's high for everybody, just lower compared to the general population. Registered Republican voters cast ballots in person at higher rates than Democratic voters. And vote by mail rejection rates were highest among Latino and young voters, particularly for young voters. And again, we see this in every election. The most common reason for rejection of a vote by mail ballot was non-matching signatures. That's for everybody. More for the pie of voters. Again, there are differences, though, in the rejection reasons and the proportions of rejected ballots by reason for each group. More early voters return their vote by mail ballot through the mail than via a drop box. Well, drop box voting was the most common method on and around Election Day. Again, big differences though by group. And then we're looking at the pie of early voters by vote propensity. Early voters were largely high propensity voters, although the histories varied across demographic groups. And as promised, here's that QR code again for the research report, especially for those of you that might have joined late. You snap this, it'll take you to the exact location of where this brand new research report is, along with a 4-page highlights brief that you might want to take a look at as well. And then right below this report, conveniently, you'll see the report that we released last week on voter turnout and lost voters in California and its companion brief. So they're right next to each other, just to make it a little easier. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my slides so I can take questions and you all can see me a little bit better. But before I do, I want to also, and I should have done this at the outset, thank Anna Meyer, who is our data lead, data manager at CID and was a lead researcher on this report, who once again did an amazing job with this research. So thank you, Anna, very much. And I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you all again very much for joining us today. Just double checking here. Okay, great. As always, greatly appreciate your engagement with our work. Let us know again if you have any questions. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope the research is helpful and useful for all of you in your different efforts. Thank you very much. Have a great day.